In the final months of the Second World War, as Allied armies closed in upon the dying Reich, an obscure village known only as Totenstadt, one Colonel von Teufel and the leading minds of this Reich sought to blend together the mystic occult arts and science in an unholy abomination. A single word of their efforts crept across the front lines to Allied intelligence. Götterdämmerung. That word was the only warning of what was to come. As these Allied armies brought the war to Germany's towns and cities, and Hitler raged within his bunker, hopes of turning the tide evaporating with each passing moment. Hitler was presented with one last option, Plan Z. Whether the result of haste or ego, the ramifications of this plan were not considered. And not long after, across Europe, Germany's dead began to rise. Hordes, million strong, fell upon the unprepared armies, annihilating some and driving the rest back. Armies that had once been on the cusp of victory found themselves retreating into France, Italy, or being pursued across to Eastern Europe. Moscow itself was besieged, citizens and soldiers alike consumed in a seemingly unending horde of the dead. Yet, it was not the Allies alone who had to fear the rising dead, for there was a flaw in von Teufel's methodology. While they could indeed erase the dead, they found they could not control them. It was in this desperate battle for survival where German, Soviet, Italian, Frenchman, American, and Brit fought shoulder to shoulder that the Second World War came to an end, and that the Dead War began. Tensions continued between these former combatants, but the desire to survive overruled all other considerations. It was in these disparate groups that the Survivor Brigade was born. These desperate groups fighting to contain the undead menace. Initially, there was little uniformity in equipment or dress, save for a yellow armband depicting a black skull. These early days were marked by unprecedented casualties and deaths. Few would survive to become veterans. Those that did learned the new trade of war, to adapt to an enemy that knew no fear of death, had no compassion for its comrades, and who seemingly cared only for the destruction and consumption of its enemy. It was in these early days that an elite unit was organized, drawn from various nations and backgrounds, to fight their way into the heart of this undead empire, to the devastated city of Berlin, in the hopes of finding some means of combating these hordes. And so they fought through countless undead forms, innumerable desolate villages and towns, eventually finding at the heart of this empire was the same man who brought the world into war so long ago. Hitler had been remade, reanimated as the mind of this undead host. Alongside his occult generals sought to bring ruination to the world. Yet even in this darkness a hope was found. The very relic that had allowed Hitler to raise the dead. There was a belief within this elite unit that this device may be made to undo its earlier efforts. Others, unwilling to risk the future of the world on such a device, greenlit Operation Red Harvest, an unprecedented bombing campaign against Berlin, culminating in the use of nuclear weaponry, in the hopes that this might destroy or at the very least contain the undead. Unfortunately, these efforts did little to slow the horde, and reports filtered west that Hitler continued to amass his forces beyond the irradiated zone. Recognizing the threat, this elite unit that had been sent to Berlin pursued Hitler, first to the fortress Folterschloss, and then deeper into the irradiated zone, where the earth itself opened into a hellish plain. Therein they faced Hitler and his general's supernatural abilities. Yet it was the elite unit who walked away. In victory, the hellish gates sealed, and reports spread that no new zombies rose from the earth, and that those that remain were disoriented, confused. This granted a reprieve to the survivors, a chance to fortify their holdings, and with time to begin the long process of purging and purifying the land of the straggling undead. The Survivor Brigade was rebranded the Resistance. The concentrated effort was made to standardize the organization. New training centers were built in the south of England. Veterans were drawn in to train new recruits in anti-necrotic warfare. Air bases were built, ports and railway stations into the interior were made into fortresses, ringed with machine guns and electrified fencing. Supplies that had once been a trickle began to flood into Europe. The continent was reorganized into reclamation zones with large-scale military clearing operations, supported with smaller dead hunter patrols. Civilians were evacuated, some to fortified settlements, others to England or Africa. To most, it appeared that the darkest days were finally behind them. Unfortunately, this reprieve would not last long. Reports trickled in of active fighting in the frontier, of growing hordes, of even an SS unit hiding out in the Alps conducting experiments upon the dead. Most troublesome were reports of a return to intelligent strategy in the dead's behavior and the disappearance of patrols. These reports were initially kept quiet, whether out of laxness or complacency we cannot say. This calm was finally broken when the truth became undeniable. When the safe house in Milan was overrun, it became clear that some form of guiding intelligence had returned to the undead, for they utilized a train to break through the safe house's outer walls, and were observed having enough mental faculties to utilize their former weapons and equipment with some proficiency. This time, as the undead hordes marched to war, they did not do so alone. They were supported in their fight by hellish versions of tanks, aircraft, and other vehicles of war, remade and through their cracked armor held together by the writhing flesh of their former crew. The survivors were pushed back, forced to fight a defensive war as stronghold after stronghold fell to the undead menace. Those who had less than a year before struck down the reanimated Hitler found themselves hunted across Italy, pushed further and further south, not only by the dead, but also a hidden cult who sought to restore Hitler and usher in an eternal Reich. To combat this new threat, a new team of elite snipers were dispatched to Italy. Fighting across the country, they met the zombie hordes in Rome. And there, following a fierce battle, they discovered that Hitler had in fact been reborn. And though they tried once more to kill him, found the task far more difficult, as in this new form he was imbued with hellish energies. And then, if records are to be believed, this elite unit was cast into hell. And yet they did not die there. Like the survivors fighting elsewhere in Europe, through grit and determination they battled on against new and increasingly deadly foes. Fighting against uncountable hordes, they emerged ready to continue their pursuit of the maddened, undead, hell-infused dictator, pursuing him into a vast siege platform held together by flesh, blood, and guts. And there, in late 1946, after defeating multiple copies of the dictator, he was once and for all destroyed, his body broken with an artifact as ancient and mysterious as the one that had been used to raise the dead. And with his death, his undead hordes were left leaderless, disoriented. With this victory, many came to believe that the end of the war was finally within their grasp. Even so, rumors persist of elite sniper teams being dispatched to Hell, hunting down the remaining cultists and defeat their so-called super zombies. Even more fantastical tales persist of still more copies of the dead dictator persisting in the depths of Hell. Surely only the future knows if this is the end of this undead menace.